Yeah, well, it's estimated to be a $1 trillion opportunity by FemHealth Insights. So there are 5 times more studies into erectile dysfunction than into PMS, even though only 19% of men have erectile dysfunction, while over 90% of women report symptoms of PMS.
Welcome to The Conversation. In today's episode of Trailblazers, Johnny is speaking to Marina Gerner, journalist and professor and author of The Vagina Business. We hope you enjoy this episode. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on social.
Marina, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Trailblazers.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to where you are now.
Absolutely. So my name's Marina Gerner. I'm the author of The Vagina Business, which you have over here. I'm also a journalist and an adjunct professor at NYU. So as a journalist, I'm quite unusual in that I've written about multiple different topics. I spent years writing about finance, and then the last couple of years I've written about technology and about health. And so all of that has eventually brought me to the book and to writing about tech innovation focused on women's health.
So where did the inspiration for the book come from through the research that you've done?
Yeah, great question. So about 5 years ago, I had an insight. And many people still don't know about this. It's if I ask you to picture a person who's having a heart attack, who do you see?
Old dude.
Exactly. An old guy. Most of us picture an old guy. That's what we tend to see in movies. And what we picture as typical symptoms is he feels pressure on his chest and pain radiating down his left-hand side. But those symptoms are typical for men. They're not typical for women. Women are much more likely to describe their chest pain as discomfort rather than pain. So there's a slight difference there. They're more likely to have long-term extreme fatigue and things like jaw pain as well, for example. So the symptoms there are different. And I found out about this at a conference about 5 years ago. The conference was organized by MIT and King's College, and there was a founder there. She's called Alicia Chong Rodriguez, and she set up Bloomer Tech, which is a company that's created a smart bra that women can wear to track their heart health. So because we typically think of male symptoms, women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed than men after having a heart attack. And women also wait longer to call for help and are also less likely to then be treated. So it cascades through the whole journey of getting treatment. And I thought, this is great because not only is there a problem, but there's also somebody who's working on a solution and who's trying to fill that particular gender data gap we have in heart health. And I ran downstairs. I was sitting in a balcony seat at this conference. I ran downstairs to ask for her business card to write about her as a journalist. And she gave me her business card. And then I pitched all of my editors, who usually say yes to my stories. I write for places like The Times and The Guardian and Wired magazine. And I didn't hear back from anybody. And I think there was this perception that it's a bit of a niche topic. Yeah, exactly. Something.
Yeah, it's niche for 50% of the world's population.
Yeah, over 50%. Exactly. And then COVID happened. And I think things changed during COVID in many ways. One of them was, I don't know if you remember this, but initially men had worse symptoms. So men were more affected. And you could say that because of that, we started paying attention to sex differences in health during COVID. And at that point, I managed to write the story about the smart bra for The Guardian, and the story did really well. And that was the first FemTech innovation that got me into the space.
Yeah, it was really fascinating when I attended your book launch and you spoke about that. It really struck me that something like that, which could be an absolute game changer for cardiovascular disease within women, was kind of so dismissed in some of the VC conversations that had been had. And then I read in the book, as we were going through it, about the forgotten investors as well, and the people that at the turn of the 20th century had pioneered kind of investing. Tell us a little bit about that and these women that have been written out of history almost.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the business world, we often think of it as a man's world, right? So I was amazed to discover this work of a group of historians at Cambridge University who have uncovered these records that were, rolled up and left behind and forgotten somewhere, that actually show us some of the statistics from the 18th and the 19th century. And they found that about 30% of British businesses were run by women, which is incredible. And some of these businesses were smaller businesses like laundrettes or fashion-focused businesses. But then you also have women worldwide at the helm of some quite unexpected companies. So let me give you some examples. So while many women historically ran smaller fashion, textile, beauty or laundry businesses, we also have examples from the 1820s. So in Paris, there was a woman called Madame Saget, who was an engineer whose company was given a government contract to set up oil-powered streetlights across Paris. There was a woman called Julia Ridgway in Albany, New York, who ran the biggest plumbing business in the region, proudly featuring herself on the advertisement as the proprietress of the business. There was Elizabeth Gold in Sydney, who ran a large plumbing and glazing business, and she was fixing all the pipes in Sydney. And there was also Rebecca Lukens in Pennsylvania, who headed up a steel manufacturer, and she was the nation's leading producer of boilerplates.
I mean, that's wild, because these are obviously industries that you would not think of women pioneering first. These are industries in which you would think very male-dominated, steel manufacturing, plumbing as another one. So what happened?
Exactly. So that's why I thought it was really important to include those examples. And the same goes for investors. So the proportion of female shareholders was 15% in 1870 in Britain, and it tripled to 45% by 1935. So those are not figures we would typically think of when we think about the proportion of female investors, even nowadays. So I was quite astonished to find that, despite being excluded from all these networks, when Britain became a nation of shareholders, women were completely part of it and involved in the world of investment. And I think remembering that women have always been part of the business world and the investment world could potentially inspire more women to be part of it today too.
100%. It's one of the projects that we worked on was a platform called F3, and that is female financial freedom. That's what the F3 stands for. And it was started by a lady that basically was having a lot of conversations at dinner parties with friends, and they were saying, could you teach me about investing? And Alison has 20 years of experience with investing in Standard Charter and all of that sort of stuff, and that's been her career. So she wanted to provide a platform from which women could feel more in control of their financial future. And actually, that speaks to the statistics that you were just highlighting there. 45% of women were investing. I mean, I don't know what the statistic would be now, but I would gauge it wouldn't be anywhere near that high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But that's often the case with women, not just in the business world, but also other parts of society, that women were at the forefront and really involved, but then got written out of history later on.
Yeah, and there's examples with coding as well as another prime example there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So talk to me about what was driving this shift towards kind of women being almost like pushed out of, if this was so prevalent, we've got 45% of women investing, there's nearly 50%, right? That's nearly half the marketplace of investors. What happened? Where did that change? What was the attitude shift?
I don't think it's one shift. I think it's more like I think it's the patriarchy is how you could phrase it. Let me give you another example. So have you ever heard of Bertha Morisot?
No.
Have you heard of Renoir?
Yes.
Have you heard of Monet?
Yes.
Right. But she was part of the group of painters who set up Impressionism. She was huge. She actually sold more paintings than Renoir, if I remember correctly. She bought herself a villa. She was one of the founders of this art movement that's probably the most popular art movement in the world. And yet nobody really, well, a few people who are really into art, but in the general world or in general society, people don't typically remember her name. And it's so shocking,
Yeah.
I think, in many ways, to think that she was successful, she was well recognized in her own time, and she was financially successful then too. But nowadays, we're just beginning to remember her now.
Yeah, and it seems like that's the case with a lot of amazing historical figures who are really blazing a trail and pioneering certain industries that just didn't seem to be remembered along the way. One of the things that you touched on in the book as well is the shift with like Milton Friedman's School of Economics and shareholder value and the spiraling wealth inequality that we're seeing at the moment globally. How is that playing a role also in women's health outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. The shift that I was talking about was moving away from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So this idea that companies need to maximize their profits, to return money to shareholders at all costs, that we're moving away from that idea to one that is more holistic and that looks at all stakeholders. So companies have to think more about their employees and their customers and the environment that they're in and so on. And I think one good example is the fertility industry. So I've just written a feature, which is an excerpt from the book for Wired magazine, on the things you should know before you freeze your eggs. And it's an industry that, okay, where do we start? Egg freezing in and of itself is a great technology. It's a great option to have. But what I have found in my research is that fertility companies do not always show people the full picture. They're not transparent about all the costs that are involved in the procedure. For example, they're not transparent enough about the risks, and they're not transparent enough about the likelihood of success. So is that considering all stakeholders, or is that trying to maximize your profits, at the expense of those who might feel they need to freeze their eggs when actually they don't?
Yeah.
Or who might, once they're starting the treatment, realize, oh, this is, not what I expected, or this has come with risks that I didn't know about, or some women have only frozen a couple of eggs, but the likelihood of having a live birth with only a few eggs, if you're, let's say, 35 years old, is really low. So some women might think, oh, I've frozen some eggs. It's a form of insurance, when in reality, insurance pays out, but this may not.
Mm. Do you have any of the numbers that are associated with this? Obviously, you just highlighted that it may be that you only get a small number of eggs harvested that are viable. So what are some of the numbers that play into this that people should be aware of when considering freezing their eggs as an option?
Great question. Now, let me look it up in the book. So I have a graph, which we can show.
Amazing.
So, for instance, for women below the age of 35, freezing 20 eggs provides a 90% chance of a live birth. At the age of 38, one would need to freeze 40 eggs for a 90% chance. So you see, those are really large numbers, because even for 20 eggs, you would typically need more than one egg retrieval. And oftentimes you pay per round of egg retrieval. So for 40 eggs, you probably need quite a few rounds of egg retrieval. And that's really important to know.
Yeah. Is there an average price that you'd be looking at in terms of those rounds of egg retrieval?
It is a very expensive procedure, but prices do vary by geography. So one cycle of egg freezing can cost, for instance, $10,000 in the US, £7,500 in the UK, and the cost can be as low as €2,750 in Spain, which is not too dissimilar from a full set of Invisalign braces.
Yeah.
So you can see why there's a lot of egg freezing tourism in Spain.
100%. But, even then, as you say, if you're going to get 40, or you're going to need to harvest 40 eggs, that's going to be many, many rounds. Even if you're doing that at €2,500, you could be doing potentially upwards of 5 rounds to get that amount. And that's a crazy amount of money for someone to be expected to pay, especially when the majority of people in the UK, especially, average salary being £30,000 a year or under.
Oh, absolutely. This is, a very expensive procedure that only a small group of people can afford, really.
Yeah. And that really does kind of play into the fact that, there is this, as we spoke about, there is this kind of inequality gap that is seemingly financially driven. And it means that there are people that can afford innovations and people that can't. Are there any other areas that this begins to show itself and play out as well?
Yeah, I think there are many areas. I think one way of looking at it is to think on the one hand, we have innovation like egg freezing for a small group of people. On the other hand, there are maternity deserts in the US and even here in the UK. There are many labor wards that are not considered to be safe for mothers. So we have this lack of access to quality care, for large parts of the population on the one hand, and then these quite innovative technologies for a small group of people on the other hand.
Yeah. When I saw you speak at your book launch again, one of the things that blew my mind was when you said that the latest innovation in childbirth for women was the epidural.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I knew I wanted to have children when I started researching this book. And I came across a company called Maternal in California, and they're working on a device that could potentially help us reduce birth injuries. So 9 in 10 first-time mothers have a birth injury, unfortunately. That's something I was aware of, so I was really excited to come across this company. And then I looked into the company, and I learned that the epidural was the latest innovation in the standard of care, and that it was popularized in the 1950s. And that's just completely bonkers to think that if you were to give birth right now and you go into a local hospital, you'll be offered the epidural, which is a great option to have, one of the best options to have. And yet it's something that is many decades old. And we haven't really seen, hundreds of new innovations coming out in that space since then.
Yeah. So given where we are right now with technology, we've got artificial intelligence, we've got any number of huge tech companies that are, delivering on this shareholder value. Why is it that we are seeing so little innovation in the area of childbirth and also across women's tech? Why isn't more VC money finding its way into the hands of amazing entrepreneurs who want to make a difference in this space?
I think there are multiple reasons for that. But something that I kept hearing from companies that have a vagina-centric innovation is that VC investors are embarrassed by the topic. And so I have this quote from one VC investor who said, "I don't want to talk about vaginas in my Monday morning partner meeting." And that kind of shows you, okay, 90% of VC investors are male. So it's a group of men and they don't want to talk about vaginas in front of their colleagues in a business setting. And so for that reason, they may not invest in companies that focus on things like birth injuries. But that's, embarrassment and shame, that's only one of the reasons. There's the fact in itself that most VC investors are men, so they can't really relate to the issue at hand. And VC investors are oftentimes former entrepreneurs, but women are still only about 20% of companies are founded by women. There's another issue there. And I think something that's quite fascinating is that when we think about investors or when we think about how we make financial decisions, we imagine ourselves as these rational human beings. But in reality, we're all very emotional and whimsical. Even investors are not immune from this. They do have their metrics, but they still invest in products that they want to use themselves.
Well, this is very interesting because I remember hearing something about Daniel Kahneman and how he spent his entire life. He won a Nobel Prize for this very thing, about how to understand rationality around financial decision making. And he was still no more rational by the end of his life than anyone else. So if even that man can be admitting of his own fallibility in this space, I think it speaks to all of us having a bit of a challenge there, perhaps. So given that we've got, these investors that are not putting money into this space. We know that they're incentivized by a certain level of financial reward. What is the potential scope of the opportunity for those that may not know or really kind of understand, if they're thinking about kind of, okay, why they should be investing more in FemTech, why they should be investing more in women's health? What is the potential scope and scale of the size of the opportunity that's in front of them with this potential market if they choose to actually start backing more amazing entrepreneurs who are doing stuff in this space?
Yeah, well, it's estimated to be a $1 trillion opportunity by FemHealth Insights and a few other places. And there are unmet needs in every category across women's health. So it's a huge business opportunity. And something like the menopause market, for instance, all women will go through menopause. Not every woman decides to have a child, but all women go through menopause. And there are at least 34 symptoms that are associated with that. So you can see how there's a huge amount of unmet need in that space, for instance.
Massively.
I think what's really fascinating is if you zoom out, VC is so, venture capital is so prevalent when we think about the business world. We think about Dragon's Den and all of those kinds of shows where people have a stake in the company and they give somebody funding in return. But how many companies in the US do you think actually receive venture capital?
I mean, I'd guess it'd be small because VCs are inherently looking for unicorns or moonshoots. So I would go sub 10% at the very least, probably sub 5%.
It's 0.25.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I love asking that question. I, teach business students and nobody ever gets near.
So 99.75% of companies will never get any VC funding.
That's correct, because only a very specific kind of company works for venture capital investors and their return expectations. But then when you look at all the companies, again, this is in the US, who have gone public, about 42% of them have been venture-backed.
Okay. So it's interesting. So you've got this 0.25% of companies being backed, but the outsized return of those companies, because 42% then go public, are VC-backed.
Yeah.
So it's easy to see why and what they're motivated by. But the thing that blows my mind in this regard is, given the scale of the opportunity that you've outlined, $1 trillion industry potentially, surely they should be hedging more bets in this field.
Yeah, and I think they're slowly getting there. According to some estimates, venture-backed companies account for 85% of research and development spending. So that shows you that they're the driving force behind innovation, venture-backed companies.
One of the other topics that I wanted to ask you about, because I had not considered this. So I mentioned previously big tech. Now, there's a lot of apps in the marketplace that help women with period tracking and other things. One of the issues that you highlighted with that, though, was who has what data, and then potentially a very dystopian situation where if a government, for example, were able to access that information and a woman had had an abortion or something like that in a country or state that was outlawed or illegal, that government could then retroactively prosecute that. What should we be mindful of when, looking at these apps? Who owns your data? And, how can we make sure that the right safeguards are in place, and what people should be more aware of in this? Because that was one of the things that absolutely shocked me, that could even be a possibility. And then I didn't think that would happen. But then we've recently seen, obviously, what's happened with the Telegram founder, where actually he has had pressure put on him for certain things that have then led to handover of information. There's been attempts previously with Meta and WhatsApp and trying to get access to information for users there. Do you think that that's something that is a real concern?
Yeah, it's something that people were talking about a lot, especially after Roe v. Wade. On Twitter, people were saying delete your period apps. And there's a study by the Electronic Frontiers Foundation. They have found that the most common scenario for those who get prosecuted for having an abortion is actually in a place where it's illegal, is when a family member, partner, or hospital staff turns them into law enforcement. And the evidence used to build a case can include messages, emails, browser history, GPS data, or purchasing history. So the scenario around period apps is possible, but it's very, very unlikely. I think overall, period app data is not the most revealing kind of data, because even if you've forgotten to enter your data for a couple of months, that doesn't actually tell you that much. And it's very easy to input false data as well. Whereas if somebody can track your location or look at your messages, then that can be much more revealing.
Okay, so less of a dystopian, hopefully, future that we're staring down the barrel of, but...
When it comes to period apps, yes, I think it's highly unlikely.
Yeah. What are some of the innovations that you've seen in that space throughout your research and kind of looking at, obviously there are some big apps in the UK, especially we've got Flow. What are some of the other innovations that we're seeing as it relates to periods, like, again, endometriosis, polycystic ovaries and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are various ways in which people can track their cycle, and period apps are just, one possibility. You also, there's a startup in Berlin called Inne, for example, where you lick a stick, so it uses saliva, and then you put it into this little gadget. It looks like a headphone case. And then it reads your hormone levels. So that's one way to track your cycle. You can also analyze cervical mucus, for example. So that changes throughout the cycle. And that is something that can be tracked. You can also track your cycle through your breath, which is something most people don't know about, but our breath changes throughout our cycle.
So it's the respiratory rate, presumably, and the carbon dioxide prevalence in the air that you're exhaling, right?
So the device that I wrote about is called Breathe ILO, and it measures CO2 levels in your breath. And that correlates to estradiol, which is a form of estrogen. So that is going down before ovulation.
Okay, that's really interesting, because that's similar to, I guess it's kind of similar to a device that I've used previously called a lumen. Essentially, it's like a thing that you use to kind of look if you're going into ketosis and things like that. So based on the carbon dioxide that you're exhaling, you have this little gizmo that you breathe into. And based on the carbon dioxide in your breath, it tells you how likely you are to be going into those phases. So I'm guessing it's a similar type of technology there.
Yeah.
So that's really, really cool. What are some of the other methods that you can use? Obviously, having read the book, there's some pretty old school tracking that you can do as well.
Yeah, I mean, some women just use an Excel spreadsheet. I was just talking to someone yesterday who told me about her Excel spreadsheet, and that's totally cool too.
Wow. Okay, so we're going back to Microsoft 95.
Whatever you're happy with, I would say.
I mean, I guess so. I mean, in writing the book, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, what are some of the things that really blew your mind in this space, and what are the things that gave you the most hope as you were kind of like, because obviously we've spoken about some of the darker aspects in terms of lack of VC funding, going into the world of kind of typical boys club with female entrepreneurs not really getting a seat at the table. What were the things that kind of really got you hopeful as you were going through this journey and researching?
Yeah, so I've interviewed 100 people, entrepreneurs, researchers, and investors. And, their stories give me hope, because they're all working on changing the system and on creating something new across all areas of women's health. So for me, it was really important to point out what the obstacles are that they're facing. Women's health has been underfunded and under-researched historically, and it's important to know that. But then the main focus of the book is on the solutions. I think of this as a book of solutions. And that was really important for me to show people that if we do FemTech well, in an evidence-based way, and in a way that really considers all the stakeholders, as we've discussed, then, this could be the start of something really big.
Yeah. How would you see a way in which men could engage in this more constructively and proactively as well?
Yeah, I've included several men in the book. I think it's really important to have everyone on board. And I don't think it's a prerequisite to be a woman. I think somebody can be an excellent addiction therapist without being an addict. You can be, you can have empathy, and you can understand the unmet need and what you're working on. Having said that, I do think it's important to have women as part of your team. So I'd always say it's crucial to have women involved in the design process from the start at a very senior level.
Yeah, I mean, target market, you want to make sure that the people that you're designing for are included and considered and actually part of the team.
Exactly. Plus, mixed teams tend to have better outcomes anyway, financially and otherwise.
Yeah, 100%. Talk to me a little bit about the disaggregation of data in clinical trials.
Yes. So women and people of color were only in the US officially included in clinical trials in 1993. And even today, we still do most of our clinical research on men. And even in studies where women are included, oftentimes the data doesn't get disaggregated by sex. So what does that mean? For example, I write a newsletter about women's health, and I wrote about Ozempic recently. And so Ozempic is something that 1 in 8 Americans have taken. And recently there have been all these reports about women getting pregnant on Ozempic, even though they're taking the pill or they previously had some kind of fertility issue. So, they had this hashtag, Ozempic babies, and like, what is going on? Is Ozempic boosting your fertility? And it turns out that it is, and there are various explanations for that. So one is, for example, that it changes the way, if you're on the pill, it changes the way the pill is absorbed into the bloodstream. It lowers the concentration, and therefore it's possible, or it's more likely for someone to get pregnant. Also, weight loss can potentially restore ovulation and a more regular cycle in somebody who previously didn't have a regular cycle. And so we have various explanations to why it boosts fertility, but there's no solid research on this.
Which is mad because GLP-1s have been around for about 40 years.
Yeah. And they're only now beginning to put together, a large study on how it correlates with female fertility.
Why was it that people of colour, women, have been excluded from clinical trials historically? I know that there was obviously something to do with a morning sickness medication that had a consequence particularly for women, but what was the reason that all of this kind of came about? Because it seems a bit crazy that 50% of people, over 50% of the people on the planet would be excluded from understanding what a potential molecule that would come to mass market could have an impact on.
Yeah, exactly. There was the thalidomide scandal. So part of it was to protect women in case we're pregnant. And that's an understandable reason. Another thought or assumption was that women are simply smaller versions of men outside of our bikini zone. And that's just not the case.
Well, absolutely. So many more complicated processes going on. And that would seem like a very naive assumption to make on the part of any. So how do we?
You could say it's a naive assumption, or you can say it's a potentially very calculating assumption, because if you're excluding the more complicated research participants, who have hormones, who might interfere with very neat results, you're saving money.
Yes, that is very, very true. Yeah, I guess if you have an interest or vested interest in a very expensive piece of research that you've been doing for any number of years, you want that set of results to be wrapped neatly in a bow so that you can recoup some of the investment that you've put in. But equally, there's also the inverse to that, which is a lot of drugs get rejected that may have efficacy in female populations because they don't show efficacy in males, right?
Exactly. And it starts at the animal level. Researchers who exclude female mice, for example, I have some of their excuses in the book.
Please share some of those, because that was wild.
Yeah, there was one team that said, We excluded female mice because their cages were harder to clean.
I mean, wow, okay, cool.
Yeah. And they're, not afraid to state that in their research paper, which is just wild.
I mean, the question that I have off the back of that, though, is surely are there consequences? Is there a body that basically is in place to prevent things like that? Because that is such a rank excuse to put forward as why you wouldn't include female mice in a study.
Yes. So there are guidelines in places like Nature, for example, which is very prestigious, but there's no real enforcement of these guidelines is what I was told by people in this space. So yes, they say include female participants, make sure you analyze the data by sex. But if you don't, what are the consequences of that? It's not like they won't accept the paper.
Okay.
At this point, we're not quite there yet. So I think there needs to be a follow-up. There need to be consequences to those guidelines as well.
Yeah, it would occur to me that they don't just need to be guidelines in a loose, optional sense. They need to be, more of a framework that actually has some solidity to it. That means if you don't follow it, well, we're not going to submit your paper.
Exactly. Or you have to have a real explanation as to why you have excluded part of the population or a sex.
Yeah. Are there any silver linings with this topic that are, there are researchers that are actually making an impact here?
So there's a study led by Professor Cassidy Sugimoto, which found that if the first author and the last author, so in other words, the two most important authors on a research paper of a study are female, the chances of their research being analyzed by sex are higher, And just how much more likely is it, do you ask? The answer is 26 times more likely.
Okay.
So that is the silver lining.
Yeah.
Women who are in charge of research are more likely to disaggregate the data by sex.
Okay. By by a factor of 26.
By a factor of 26 if the first and the last author are female.
Wow. And what could be the potential impact of getting more women into research and actually finding, more drugs from molecule to market that could have greater efficacy for women?
Another study at Harvard Business School found that all female inventor teams are 35% more likely than those with an all-male team to focus on women's health. So again, if you have skin in the game, you're more likely to focus on the things that you might then benefit from.
Yeah. So basically, having a group of people that are motivated because they will actually experience what's going on will be the people to carry that forward, so to speak.
Exactly. They're more aware of it and it might affect them personally, or they might know someone.
Yeah. There was a question I wanted to ask you that was kind of like, it was a bit niche and rogue, because I know that there's certain things that could be downstream consequences of it because of, this was the chapter that I think I was about on last night, which was, what do Kindles and orgasms have in common? Which was the, other than the literary, so, because I know that there was the touch, the force sensitivity thing.
Yeah.
So what do Amazon Kindles and orgasms have in common?
Great question. So I've interviewed a founder called Anna Lee. She founded Lioness, which is a smart vibrator, and it has 2 force sensors on the side. And it's the same kind of sensor that turns the page on a Kindle. And in the case of the Lioness, they use that to measure pelvic floor contractions, and they then map orgasms on an app. So they look at different patterns. They've collected, I think, 100,000 data sets or sessions. And they look at, the most common kinds of female orgasm, and they also look at how female orgasms intersect with other areas of health. So they had a case study of an athlete, for example, who saw that her orgasm was flatlining, and it turned out she had a concussion. So, your orgasm can be indicative of other issues that are going on.
So an orgasm can actually have implications for your health more broadly speaking, and it could be an indicator as to where you might, in the case of this athlete, have a concussion, or what are some of the other health things that you could identify in that regard?
Yeah. They've also looked at the intersection between coffee and orgasms, alcohol and orgasms, so how that impacts somebody's orgasm. And then I think there's research on men and sleep apnea. So there could potentially be a similar link for female orgasms and sleep apnea.
One of the questions I actually wanted to ask as well. Sorry, I've got so many things that are flooding into
No,
my brain.
I know. There's a lot. I know.
The number of or the amount of money, what was the spend into erectile dysfunction
Yes.
versus
Yes, exactly. So there are 5 times more studies into erectile dysfunction than into PMS, even though only 19% of men have erectile dysfunction, while over 90% of women report symptoms of PMS.
Yeah. That was one of the other ones that kind of like really stuck in my brain, because that was frankly bananas. As you said, there's a lot of stuff that is in this space that is bananas. What are you seeing in terms of reasons to be really optimistic in the short, medium, and long term? So if we break it down into kind of like 3 time horizons, what are the things that you're kind of the most excited about after everything that you've researched and all the 100 people that you've interviewed and all of the different areas that you've looked at?
Yeah. So, for example, in 2023, women's health companies received 4.3% of the total VC invested in health-focused companies, which is a small percentage, right? You hear 4.3%. It's small, but it's a 59% increase from the previous year. So we are making incremental progress. I think it just takes longer than people think.
Yeah. It's a mindset shift, a mentality shift. And I think hopefully with more people getting comfortable about talking vaginas on a Monday morning meeting, that will continue to happen, and less embarrassment around that. I think one of the things that gives me hope is that there's people like yourself who are actually bringing some of this information into the public domain more. And I loved the title of the article that you'd written back when this journey started. If you wouldn't mind kind of.
Yes, of course. I wrote an article for Wired magazine, and it was called "We Need to Talk About Investors' Problem with Vaginas." And that article went viral. It really hit a nerve. I got lots of messages from founders and from male investors as well saying, I had this issue initially. I was a bit embarrassed, but now I'm not. Now I'm over it. And I think, especially with younger millennial investors, you do see a shift in attitudes. And I'm really grateful that you say this book will have this impact as well, because that's what I'm hoping it will achieve. I am hoping to bring these topics into the mainstream and to give people the insights and the information and the inspiration to go into this space, because I want to attract more researchers into the space, more investors, more entrepreneurs. We're only at the very beginning of what could be.
100%. I think it's really important, the work that you're doing, and I think books like this are vital because, again, speaking as someone myself, I was fascinated and captivated by this book. It really had so much information that I would never have considered. Even things around speaking about next generation, the chapter about breastfeeding and talking about how many mothers actually don't do that because it has such an impact that I don't think many people outside of mothers or the guilt that they have put on them, that's something that I don't think many people would be aware of.
Absolutely. I have several, new creations that are focused on breastfeeding. Many people will know about breast pumps, but there's also a smart nipple shield, for example, that can measure the amount of milk that a baby is getting. And I think when that comes to the market, it will have a huge impact in terms of us being able to know the amount of breast milk that a baby is getting, and for us to be able to do research with that as well. And breast milk it's one of those things where we know that it's good for the baby, but I really want us as a society to get to the point where we don't shame mothers who do not breastfeed. So it's good to appreciate the ingredients of breast milk. And there are over 250 proteins in breast milk that we still haven't identified. There are all these really mysterious ingredients, and breast milk is actually used in research unrelated to babies. It can be used for various diseases. So breast milk could have all these incredible effects on various parts of our health. But at the same time, there are mothers who don't want to breastfeed or can't breastfeed. And I think we need to stop polarizing women on this topic. And we need to, move away from the motto breast is best to saying fed is best. So a fed baby, is a happy baby.
Yeah, I agree. I think the shame and guilt that is put on a new mother when she's got all of these other things that she's coping with, all of the hormone changes and all of the sleep deprivation and all the other things that come with motherhood, to have, that also put on you is an unnecessary burden. What are some of the areas in which you are most excited about with the research that you've done? What are the things that kind of actually blew your mind as well? What are some of the most exciting things that you found out?
All of them. No, actually, I think everybody I've included in the book has been included because they have blown my mind in some way. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of companies and nonprofits and research projects, and everybody I've included has done something special where I thought, wow, I hadn't thought of it in this way, or I didn't even know this existed. So, yeah, there's nothing that hasn't fascinated me.
Yeah. If there were some headline stats that you wished everyone would know and could take away, what would they be?
Okay, so there is 5 times more research on erectile dysfunction than PMS, even though only 19% of men suffer from erectile dysfunction, while 90% of women report symptoms of PMS. In 2023, 4.3% of venture capital invested in health companies focused on women's health, but it's an increase of 59% from the previous year. Women make 80% of healthcare decisions, but only 4% of R&D is focused on women's health. Startups founded by women only got 2.1% of VC money in 2023 in the US.
Wow. Okay. At a time in history, there was 45% of companies had invested. That just, again, the way that things have shifted so drastically seems completely...
Yeah. But it sort of comes and goes. It's not like it was better. It sort of, comes back and goes up and down.
Yeah, but hopefully we're getting to a place where it is kind of shifting again. I think, I think we're seeing way more advancement in kind of STEM and all of that sort of stuff, and then, as I said, some of the stuff that was in there about kind of engineers and that have used advancements from adjacent things that you'd never think would find their way into FemTech and kind of like women's health is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, if people want to find out more, if people want to get in touch, how can they?
Yeah, so you can find the Vagina business everywhere. Books are sold on Amazon or at your local bookshop. You can find me on Instagram or LinkedIn, and I also write a newsletter on Substack. So you can Google marinagerner.substack.com.
What does the next little while hold for you?
Right now, I'm really focused on promoting this book, and I have an idea for the next book. I'm not quite ready to share it yet.
Fair. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you so much for having me.